Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. When you're ready to launch your next project, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so you should check out Linode at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for running your next app. You can also visit our site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And to help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes or Google Play Music and tell your friends and coworkers. We also have a community site at discourse.pythonpodcast.com where you can talk to other listeners and suggest ideas and ways to make the show better. Your host as usual is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Martijn Faassen about the Morepath web framework. So Martijn, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Martijn Faassen. I call myself a web developer. I'm from the Netherlands, and I've been doing Python for a while, since 1998. And I do various other things like garden and play role-playing games and various other geeky and less geeky things.
What are some of your favorite role-playing games?
Recently I've been playing 13th Age. That's, it's kind of I actually in my whole sort of years and years of playing role-playing games, I never actually played any variety of D&D. For some reason I managed to avoid that. But 13th Age is sort of a spin-off fork of the D&D system, and I've been enjoying sort of doing that. It has a lot of wacky monsters and it's easy to run, so I've been enjoying that game. And we've been started playing Pathfinder as well recently.
Yeah, I'm a fan of board games and tabletop games, so I'll have to take a look at that one. And how did you first get introduced to Python?
Well, in 1998, I was programming an artificial life simulation in C++, and I read about some ways to analyze your C++ code base to see how, the module dependencies were and whatnot. So I thought, okay, I read about these scripting languages in a magazine article, I listed a whole bunch of them, and let's see whether I can write a little script to help me manage my code base. So, of course, I tried out Perl, which was the big fish at the time. I had it on my Linux box. I kind of liked some of it, like I liked how it was so easy to create these data structures, and that you didn't have to worry about manual memory management and such, but I couldn't quite get my head wrapped around it. And then one day I printed the Python tutorial, and then I read it in the evening, and then I always joked that the next day I could program in Python. Not very well and not very idiomatic, but I could use Python. It sort of clicked for me. And then I was looking for a job around that time, and I got into contact with the local university, and they were looking for someone who could fix they had this DOS batch file driven database munging code going on, and it broke, and the person who created it was gone and would never return, and they wanted someone to fix it. So I said, so should I fix that code? No, we want you to throw it away because it's completely unmaintainable. And then I said, so I have to write it a new version of it, and can I use Python? And of course, it was 1998, nobody ever heard of Python, so they said, Python, we never heard of that. Is that a readable language? And I said, no, yeah, Python is very readable. And then a few weeks after I discovered Python, I was programming, I had a job programming Python, and then I joined the Python news group, and then I shortly after started working with Python professionally. I saw this thread there in a news group where lots of people were lamenting that they had to use some other programming languages in their day job, and they wished they could use Python. And I sort of stumbled into it, and basically haven't touched C++ since then. And it was kind of funny how people were lamenting, and I just sort of accidentally happened to get a job doing Python. And then I quickly rolled into web development. SOAP was released the same year, and I started getting into doing web development with that, and sort of did a lot of stuff with Python over the years.
Yeah, it's definitely funny how things can work out like that, where some people will be using a language for quite some time as their preferred language, but only as side projects, and still aren't able to use it in their primary role, and other people come into a primary role and find their favorite language. So
Yeah, I just lucked into it because I proposed Python to them and they said okay, and then that was it. And then I brought in Zope and all kinds of I would always try, whenever we had meetings and said, oh, we have this problem, I said, oh, I can write a Python script for it, until that became a joke.
So can you tell us a bit about what the Morepath framework is and the problem that you were trying to solve when you created it?
Yeah, Morepath is a Python web framework, a server framework, like so many other, like a Flask or a Django or a Pyramid. Besides trying to actually solve actual problem, it's also actual problems. It's also an act of creativity as much as actually solving a problem. I just sort of can't help myself creating new things once every while. And I'd been using web frameworks and helping create them for so many years. This was sort of it's like, let's do it again, and this time for real. Kind of a reaction. What I was trying to do with Morepath is to create a web framework that would make it easy to create REST web services. That was sort of one of the primary goals. And then REST's sort of definition has eroded somewhat over the years. Originally, it had this whole notion of links between resources and automated discovery very much part of the definition, but that's not how people use REST in practice. So another way to say the same thing is that Morepath tries to be good at helping you build hypermedia APIs, which is sort of the modern way to express what REST used to mean. And my background is in Zope, which was sort of the big web framework from its first release in Python land, at least from its first release in 98 for almost a decade afterwards. And Zope software is huge and convoluted and has all kinds of history in it, but it also has a lot of power. And one thing that I wanted to do is express the power of Zope, the things I'd learned that worked well in Zope, and express it in a very small and flexible form. So that's why I call Morepath a microframework. So that sort of from the perspective of my experience with web frameworks.
And you mentioned that one of the primary concerns of Morepath is the ability for it to be RESTful, whatever definition of REST people want to apply to it. And as you mentioned, one of the original ideas behind REST was the fact that there would be this linking between resources. So what are some of the ways that Morepath makes it easy to create those resources? And also, is there any sort of built-in support for some of the various standards, such as the JSON API or some of the standardized REST methods that are outlined in of course, I'm going to blank on the name of the book.
RESTful Web Services, perhaps?
Yes,
I don't know.
The one.
Yeah. I only read the first edition of that, but I have the new edition, but I haven't read it yet, actually. I think it's got renamed as well. It's not really a new edition. It's kind of a partial rewrite, I believe. So Morepath doesn't do anything specific about JSON API, which is slightly newer, I believe, in its sort of when it came together. But it tries to be, it's more low level than that. So it tries to be flexible enough to let you implement things like that, but it doesn't actually automate it itself. Could be part of an extension, but it's that's not currently something we do. At the time, I also played quite a lot with JSON LD, which is sort of this semantic web link data solution, and there is this emerging specification called Hydra that also lets you sort of define a RESTful API, but I sort of came back from that because it's sort of still too much semantic web, and it's hard to wrap my head around what they want to do sometimes. It has nice features, but it also has some drawbacks. But what Morepath tries to be is sort of flexible enough and small enough so that you can implement things like that on top of it. And since it allows you to write reusable and generic code, it is actually fairly easy to define libraries that provide some standard views so that if you implement a certain kind of model, it will automatically generate that kind of front end for you.
And does it have any capability to be able to support some of the newer standards such as GraphQL or Falcor?
No, and actually that was kind of an interesting experience. So I spent some years building a web framework that could do REST really well, right? And then this whole emerging no REST movement started sometime last year. I guess it really started getting traction, and that gave me some pause because I think some of the sort of the criticisms of REST and the improvements to REST that, in particular, GraphQL, which I have the most sort of experience looking at, what it offers is actually, there's a lot of validity in the points they make. And as somebody who's been doing REST for a very long time, that sort of was an interesting thing to have to deal with. And Morepath itself is not really good fit for serving a GraphQL backend, because it's all about HTTP, and GraphQL is just not about HTTP. And so while, a website or web application and a GraphQL service could very well coexist, they don't really have much to do with each other. And so I started thinking like, okay, well, if GraphQL is perhaps the future, then what am I doing developing Morepath, right? That's kind of an interesting question to have to face as a developer after you spend a couple of years into a framework. But of course, REST is not going to go away anytime soon. There is still plenty of new development happening. And it turns out that Morepath is actually also quite a useful framework for developing any web application, including non-REST web applications, meaning just classic web applications that generate HTML on the server and provide dynamic content. It works well for that as well, and that's certainly not going away anytime soon either. So whereas perhaps this whole future of doing web services is not supported by Morepath, there's still plenty of things you can do with Morepath that are not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, as with anything in technology, there's always going to be a long tail of solutions and technologies that are used by a large number of companies and individuals, even beyond the point where it stops being the most talked about thing. So there are a lot of cases where you hear people talking about the decline of a particular language or framework, and then you actually go start talking to people and they're still using it in their day-to-day and they're perfectly happy with it. So...
Yes, and I don't think that, HTML generated by the server sitting by the HTTP server is not sort of the declining technology of the day. That's still extremely relevant. How you implement web services, well, it's interesting that there are now sort of new ideas again. That, of course, arose in part because of our experience with doing REST for so many years now. But since Morepath is just it's a good way to do any HTTP application, not just web services, I don't think it's become irrelevant in the last year.
And I'm assuming that it speaks the standard WSGI protocol?
Yes, it's a WSGI framework.
And do you have any plans for any modifications to Morepath to make it more compliant with the new HTTP2 specification?
No, I haven't really thought a lot about that. The basics of HTTP, even in HTTP2, are just still very similar and generally would be handled by a front-end framework. So if that speaks HTTP2, then your WSGI should still work, but I haven't really looked into it very much. I don't know how HTTP2 would affect WSGI. There is the whole notion of dealing, it can deal better with streaming resources and with lots of small accesses and reusing the same connection and all that stuff, but that's more something for HTTP server than for a web application framework, I would say. I have thought a little bit about sort of asynchronous frameworks, like the whole HTTP AIO framework, I believe it's called, and the whole Python 3 async infrastructure. And I see some interesting potentials for the way Morepath does its routing and does its view lookup to make that async. I'm not sure whether there would be a real significant benefit, but that would be interesting to explore. But I've only thought about that so far. I haven't really done anything with it.
So the tagline on the documentation for Morepath is that it's a web microframework with superpowers. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what the superpowers are that it has and what makes it special or different that sets it apart from some of the other options in the Python ecosystem that people might already be using.
Right. So Morepath is a small web framework, but it tries to pack a lot of power in the small package. And things that set Morepath apart are centered, I think, around perhaps 3 topic areas, but maybe we can restrict that to 2. One thing that Morepath tries to do very well, which is sort of something that I learned from from Zope, in particular the Zope 3 project, is that it treats configuration of code as an actual explicit thing. And by that I mean that many web frameworks in Python sort of implicitly, they have configuration systems in their code base. And what I mean by configuration system is, for instance, a way to register views with routes. That's configuration, or to give a permission to some particular access. That's another sort of aspect of configuration. Or to perhaps register middleware for your whole pipeline, so that whenever requests come in and they go out, they are handled. And there are actually quite a few different things you can configure in a typical web framework. And many web frameworks have ad hoc mechanisms to do this. So they have one way to register routes, and they have another way to perhaps plug in generic views, and they have another way to do middleware registration. And what Morepath tries to do is that it makes that explicit. And by making it explicit in the code, you can actually reason about it. So that means that extensions and overrides, if you have a piece of code that you want to reuse and you want to extend it or override it, which happens a lot, is a general principle. It's not an ad hoc sort of. The framework doesn't have to offer an ad hoc API to do all these different tasks of overriding or adding configuration to the system as separate APIs. So sort of a general principle of how you do that. So that's one big part of, I think, what sets Morepath apart. Shares that with Zope and also Pyramid, which is also inspired by Zope. Pyramid also has a configuration system. And the other aspect that makes Morepath different from most web frameworks is that its publisher, and by publisher I mean sort of the system that turns an HTTP request with a URL in it to a view code that is being rendered and returns either a JSON result or an HTML, dynamically rendered HTML result. And the publisher of Morepath is structured differently than what most web frameworks do. Most web frameworks are routing frameworks, and you define routes, you define paths, and when the path in the request matches the path in your route, perhaps with some variables in it, then you have a view function associated with it, and that gets the request and then has to return a HTTP response with some result in it, some JSON or some HTML or whatever. And Morepath is also a routing framework, but it sort of divides this routing into two steps. First, it routes you to an instance of a Python object, which I call a model, and then for that model, it looks up a view. And the view is responsible for taking the model and taking this Python object and taking the request object and then returning the response. And it actually turns out that this is something that you do in routing frameworks, in any routing framework, not just Morepath anyway, but it's sort of, the framework doesn't know about it. It's left to the view functions to do this. So what you do in a Django view function or a Flask view function is typically you look up your Python object instance from a database, and then immediately in that same function you start generating the response for it based on it. And what Morepath does is separate that into two steps, and that gives it all kinds of sort of interesting consequences that it can exploit and automate that other frameworks just don't know about.
Going back to what you were saying about the fact that Morepath has a more standardized approach to configuring the layout of the application, in particular the middleware, I'm wondering if it would be able to solve one problem that I've experienced recently where, for instance, in Django, I was trying to figure out an easy way to hook into a particular function call in one of the middleware stacks so that I could cache the call and return, short circuit the response so that I don't have to go out to the database every time. But there isn't really an obvious way of doing that aside from just monkey patching the middleware itself. So I'm wondering if that would be something that would be easier to solve with the way that Morepath handles the layering of the application.
I think so. Part of the middleware story I stole from Pyramid. Should give credit there. So Morepath has this concept called tweens, which are basically very simple middleware that gets a request. They get a request and have to return a response and then defer to underlying middleware. And there is there's a sorting subsystem inside of Morepath that can do sorting by dependency. So it does a topological sort, and it's very easy to sort of insert middleware between two other middlewares by just specifying in your configuration this middleware needs to be under or over this other piece of middleware. And what you can do is you can write an application. If you already have an application that somebody else is maintaining for whatever reason, and that has middleware already, and you want to insert your own middleware into this, then with Morepath it's actually very simple. Subclass that application object and then insert sort of your own middleware there, and the original application class is not affected by it. So if somebody else uses it, they don't have to worry about your middleware, but when you use it, you use its subclass, and the middleware will be where you expect it to be. And that's a general principle that doesn't just apply to middleware, but also to views and routes and permissions and sort of everything that can be configured can be overridden or extended in the same way, just by subclassing the other Morepath application and then associating new configuration sort of statements in the form of Python decorators to it.
It can be difficult to convince somebody to migrate to a new framework, especially if there's a lack of any supporting ecosystem for that framework. So I'm wondering, what are some of the motivating factors for a developer to want to switch to Morepath if they've already got experience with one of the more widely used frameworks?
Well, that's actually, I've thought about that a lot, and I don't have a great answer for it. This is not the first time I helped create a web framework. I actually started the Grok project back in 2006, which was based on Zope technology, and it was a sort of an attempt to make that more approachable. And in 2006, when that got started, it was still a lot easier to attract people to your framework than it is today. Today, there are so many Python web frameworks around that it's very hard to get any traction. And Morepath is in this difficult niche where, on the one hand, it tries to present itself as an approachable framework, but it sort of has all this power inside it at the same time. And it's kind of hard to sell, because the people who need powerful frameworks, they might be using Pyramid already, and that's fine. It's a great framework. It can do more than Morepath can probably. In the end, it's a little bit less opinionated, making it perhaps a little bit harder to figure out sort of how you want to organize it. But, those users are happy already, so they're not going to switch to Morepath. On the other hand, if I try to convince somebody who's already using Flask or perhaps Django to say, okay, you should consider Morepath, they might not actually see some of the value that it brings, because either they haven't experienced this whole, for instance, this configuration story, or maybe they have experienced the problems, but they don't realize there are actually solutions to some of these problems. Like, hey, I want to specifically override this thing, so now I need to monkey patch. And they just sort of, or the framework needs to provide some specific APIs so I can do this specific thing to it. And all these specific APIs are ad hoc. Then you might not actually realize that there are better ways to do it if you don't have experience with frameworks like Zope or Pyramid. So it's hard to sell sort of either way. And plus, it was just a very crowded field. But I would say if you are looking for flexibility, if you're looking for power in the form of reuse potential, reusing applications in various ways, both through inheritance and composition. If you want something that's still small and manageable, it's a micro framework that you can plug into existing applications, perhaps, that need a web front end. That's sort of where Morepath fits. And I also think it helps you organize your code better. So if you're interested in sort of Morepath encourages you to structure your code in a way that I think actually works better for web applications by separating the way you look up the model instance and the way the view is looked up. It actually encourages you to structure code in a way that will lead to more readable code, I think. And then it can use that information. So it can, if you need a powerful permission system, or if you need a way to automatically generate links without worrying about the details everywhere, if you want that to be easy, then Morepath is there for you as well. Concerning Morepath's ecosystem, is actually small, but there is actually quite a bit already out there. So if you want database integration or different authentication systems or different template languages, static resource serving, there's a lot of stuff out there already that you can use because it actually is relatively easy to make a Morepath extension.
Yeah, from looking through the documentation, it seems that because of the fact that a large portion of the way that you would add support for additional capabilities is just through subclassing and overriding a certain method, that it would be fairly simple to wrap existing libraries so that you just need to write a little bit of glue code. And then you can leverage one of the existing libraries for supporting whatever functionality it is that you need, whereas some of the other frameworks like Flask or Django might have a bit more boilerplate or specific structure necessary to be able to actually bring in that additional capability.
Yeah, usually it's just if you want to use the capability, it's by subclassing an application that sort of configures that capability already. One interesting thing is that if you build a larger application or you build a selection of larger application, you often end up with a lot of common code between them that sort of is edging towards becoming its own little framework, and Morepath makes that transition from application specific code and framework code very smooth. So if you already have code in an application that starts like you want to factor it out into its own library and then you can reuse it in multiple places, the path towards that in Morepath is very smooth. As opposed to, I think, frameworks which have, but where you suddenly have to go to a whole different way of configuring things or a different way of thinking.
So can you share a bit about what the internal architecture of Morepath looks like and some of the challenges that you have faced or are facing while building it?
So I would say it falls apart into three areas. One is the publisher, which does the routing and the view lookup. Then there's the configuration engine, which is in its own library called Dectate. And there is the predicate dispatch system, which is used by the view lookup system and also by the permission system and a few other areas in Morepath. That's in its own library called Reg. And Morepath is basically a package that defines a whole bunch of directives based on Dectate, on the Dectate system, to configure its publisher. So you can add routes and you can add views and you can add permission rules and middlewares and things like that. And that's sort of what the Morepath package really does besides the publisher implementation itself. And challenges I had building it, perhaps it's more interesting to speak sort of in terms of history of these different subsystems, because they actually go back quite a while in my thinking to before Morepath was actually born in 2013, I believe. I mean, the publisher, the way that routing works to a model and the way view lookup works it goes back to something that I did for Grok, I think probably closer to 10 years ago now, where I realized that I was using Zope, and Zope doesn't use a routing system. And Zope uses traversal. And traversal gets you to a view that renders a HTTP response in a different way. What basically happens is that when you have a URL path like A/B/C, what a traversal system does is break it apart into steps. So you have step A, step B, and step C. And then it has an object tree. So there's some kind of in-memory object tree, or perhaps it's generated on the fly, of Python objects. And perhaps the outer object is in the root and it's called A, and the root object simply has an attribute called A, or perhaps it has an item like in a dictionary with the key A, and the routing system then just fetches that object and then it goes looking for B in the object that it finds then, and then perhaps it does another get item access into that object and it finds B, and then it looks further and it does another get item access to find C, and then in the end it's like, okay, I have this object now that represents, I don't know, date on a calendar or a to-do item in a database of to-do items or whatever it might be in that tree, and then it looks up a view for it, and the view is then a function that takes that instance and it takes the request and it returns the response. And that works very well especially if you have an object database like you have in Zope. Zope application is typically based on the ZDB, which is a very nice and powerful Python object database, which lets you just store arbitrary Python objects in tree form without worrying too much about anything else. You just change attributes and you just know that they're going to be saved in the database. You can add objects, they're going to be saved in the database. So it's just like working with an in-memory tree. But it doesn't work so well, this traversing approach, when you actually have a relational database, because even with an ORM, it's actually quite hard to turn a relational database into a tree of objects in Python. There's all kinds of sort of details like how do you navigate a collection attribute, what names do these things get. And I experimented a little bit with that approach to do traversal through a relational database, but I realized that routing is actually a better approach when you need to deal with this kind of data. But I like the aspects, some aspects of the traversal system. I liked that it was possible to create a link for everything that you find in that object tree really easily. If you have an object, it's actually relatively easy to just walk back up the tree and reconstruct the path that was taken. And so for any object in the database, you can just easily create a hyperlink without having to know about how to do that everywhere in your code. So because that creates tight coupling between the code that needs to make the link and the object that you're linking to. And I didn't like that. And another thing that I like of this approach is that it separates this whole model lookup from the view lookup, because then you can become more flexible with the ways views are looked up. You can look up the view based on the class of the object that you find. So that for a base class, you define a view for a base class and it will automatically work for all the subclasses. So maybe you have a base class called document and then you have a more specific document subclass and it will just automatically share the views with the base class. It also helps you structure sort of your code when you separate those two concepts of resolving to a model and resolving a view for a model. So what I then sort of had this sort of this problem that I wanted the features I liked from traversal, but I also wanted the features I liked from routing, and that's how I ended up creating a library for Grok called Traject, which tried to sort of square that circle and have the best of both worlds. And then that sort of directly led into the publishing engine for Morepath. So I already had some experience with this approach and I liked it in the context of the Grok Web Framework before I doubled down on it in Morepath. The configuration engine goes back, as I already mentioned, to my history with the Zope Web Framework, and I already sort of saw the power of the configuration engine. Dectate is very much sort of my attempt to make it also more approachable, to make it very easy to do particular common things you want with the configuration framework. Grok was already a reaction to the way Zope configuration worked, because in Zope 3 you had to configure things with XML files, and you would always have to look at the XML file in your Python code, and it became sort of very cumbersome, at least to me and a bunch of other people. Some people like the approach, to each their own. So Grok tried to integrate the configuration with Python code already, and that led to my that experience with Grok also led into the Morepath configuration engine, together with looking a lot at what Pyramid has done, because Pyramid also builds on ideas from Zope. So it was very interesting to see how Chris McDonough approached things, and I stole a lot of ideas from him. And then the Reg library goes back to my experimentation with the Zope component architecture. Zope has this powerful system for looking up objects by their interface. So when you have you say, I want something that can send email, then you have this interface that describes how you can that's like an email sender interface, and then you can look one up and you can just plug in an arbitrary email sending concrete object into the system. You can register one and then you can just ask for the abstract object and the interface of doing it, and then that allows you to build more pluggable applications, which is something that Zope is good at. And that also works that way with view lookup, where you say, okay, I have a document, now give me something that can actually render it to an HTTP response. So I worked with the Zope component architecture for years, and I liked it, but I wanted to improve just a few tiny little things about its API to make it sort of more easy and to sort of consolidate a whole bunch of separate APIs into a smaller, simpler, more generic API. So I proposed that to the Zope people, to the other Zope developers, but it never got any traction. And then I also was actually interested in how it was implemented, because there's this whole looking at stuff up by interface, and interfaces can be subclasses from other interfaces, and extending other interfaces, and then you want to find the right thing. There's some interesting algorithms going on there. So I also separately, actually, from the improving the API story, I played with creating my own implementation of the Zope component architecture, just to have an idea of how that worked. It was basically just play at the time. And then when I started building Morepath, I thought, okay, well, actually I can put those two experiments together. I can create a better API on top of a re-implementation of the component architecture. And that was the start of the Reg library, sort of a general library for pluggability, for looking up things by their interface, or actually in Reg by their by the class. So you can say, okay, I want something that subclasses this particular class. Or I want to register something for a base class and then look up something for its subclass. It could do that. But then when I had created reg, I realized that actually this started looking very much like a generic function library, like you have in functools in Python, I believe already, like a generic dispatch system where you have a function that dispatches on its arguments, and basically any Python method could be seen as a generic dispatch function already. When you have a method and you call that method, effectively what implementation of, when you call a method on an object, you just call it by its name, and what specific implementation of the method is used is dependent on the class of the instance that you're actually calling the method on. So if you call a method on that's called foo on an instance of a class A, then it will look at that method, and if you call it on B, then it will look at the method of B. And you can sort of generalize that by saying, okay, well, the first argument to the function will look at its class, and if the class is A, then we'll dispatch to this concrete function. If the class is B, we'll dispatch to another concrete function. And that's sort of single dispatch on the first argument, and that makes it sort of possible to extend objects without changing their classes, to sort of extend classes without changing them, because you can add something that behaves like a method, but it's just a Python function, and it dispatches on its first argument. And you can generalize that, and that's what reg then started doing by looking not just at the class of the first argument, but looking at the class of any of its arguments. And that's what's called a generic function call. And you can say, okay, I want to call this function, but the concrete function that is being called depends on the classes of its arguments. Not just its first argument, but other arguments as well. And they have a resolution algorithm that determines which concrete reg function that you registered actually gets called. And then you can generalize that. I realized after a while that generic function calls were very nice, but I also wanted to dispatch not just on the class of the argument, but also dispatch on the value of an argument in some cases. And that occurs in Morepath's view lookup system, where you say, okay, I want to now get a view for this object, and that's registered as a generic function. So if you can register a view for a document, you can register a view for an animal class or whatever it might be, and then when Morepath looks up a view, it will look at the class of the instance that it found through routing, and then find the view that way. And with reg, what you also want to do in Morepath is you want to look at other aspects, like for instance the request method. Is if this is a get request, then I want to look up a different view than if it's a post request, and if it's a put request, I want to do something else again. And in Morepath there's also a notion of a view name, so the last segment of the path can actually identify a view by name. So maybe your view is called edit or delete or whatever it might be. And you also want to dispatch on that. So then I generalized generic dispatch into something that is called predicate dispatch, where you can basically dispatch a function not just on the class of its arguments, but also on the value of its arguments. And that's what's underlying Morepaths now, and is exploited fully by its view subsystem, which is entirely based on reg. And that was sort of an interesting evolution, going from just a better API and an alternative implementation to the SOAP component architecture to a predicate dispatch library, which is useful by itself. If you have a need for such fairly obscure features, you can download reg and you can use it directly.
Yeah, it's interesting how dynamic dispatch or multiple dispatch in the Python ecosystem isn't very popular. Part of that is because of the fact that it's not built into the core of the language, but there are a number of libraries that add that capability to the language, but they don't seem to be very widely used despite that fact. And one of my earlier experiences with learning programming was with the C++ language, which does support multiple dispatch and function overloading. So I got some exposure to the power of that. And there are some cases where I'll be working on a project in Python and thinking about how being able to do that function overloading would have been useful. But in that particular instance, it wasn't necessarily worth the extra weight of pulling in another dependency to add that capability. But I could definitely see cases where it would be useful and beneficial to have that option. And it's interesting that there's also just sort of a lack of visibility into that capability for people who are getting started with Python, where they don't know that that is something that is done in other languages or frameworks.
Yeah, it's quite common in some other languages, and yeah, extending a class without actually having to modify it is quite a useful feature, and without having the subclasses as well, especially in a framework that aims to be extensible like Morepath does. Reg, of course, as far as I know, doesn't have any users outside of Morepath itself. But I sometimes just split off stuff into its own library, not so much because I'm hoping it will get a huge amount of traction, even though, of course, I'm in the back of my head that would be nice, but because it sort of isolates the whole problem from the rest of the problem. So Reg is just about doing predicate dispatch well, and it's just basically functions that you can register other functions for and say, okay, call this one if my argument happens to be a subclass of this, or if my argument, an instance of a class of this class, or if my argument has this value, and that's what it worries about. And I can sort of think about that in isolation and document it and make it work well and make it work fast, and have other people contribute to it that way as well, without having to worry about web frameworks for a little while. And I find that is a very useful sort of creative exercise that makes it easier to solve problems in a good way. Reg is just 500 lines of code in the end. It actually was bigger a little bit before, but we managed to shrink it down a little bit further again. And yeah, I like it, and if people want to use it, then I'd be happy, but it's already worthwhile to separate it into its own thing, even without that.
Yeah, it definitely makes it much easier to reason about a project when you're able to break it into separate components. And it also encourages you to think hard about whether or not you need to add a particular piece of coupling between two portions of the code base. So when you have it as a separate component, it discourages you from having that tight coupling, which makes it easier to isolate the responsibilities of the various pieces of the code, as well as the sort of entire goal of object-oriented programming, and even functional programming for that matter, is code reuse. And it's easy to get stuck in the trap of just writing it all in the same code base and ending up with that tight coupling, and you lose sight of that reuse option. And by breaking it into separate dependencies, even if they aren't used elsewhere, it will at least keep you thinking about the fact of, well, I've got this piece, maybe I can use it for this other project. And then also thinking, even within a single project, thinking hard about what are the responsibilities of this piece of code, and does it need to be included here, or could I extract it into something else?
Yeah, it makes APIs better if you sort of think about them as their own thing, and test them as their own thing, and also document them as their own thing. It just makes it easier to think about. I agree.
Going back to the automatic link generation that Morepath is built around, you mentioned that it helps you ensure that you don't end up with dead links in the website, but I'm wondering if there's any support for permalinks or automatic redirects, so for when you refactor a project, so that if you have links out on the internet to a particular location in the application, when somebody goes to visit it, they don't necessarily end up at a dead-end path.
Morepath's sort of link generation system is primarily aimed to actually making it easy to do links and to reduce the tight coupling between pieces of code. So when you make a link in, well, the most simple way to create a link, the most naive way to create a link in a web application is to simply hard code the link, interpolate a few of the variables, like maybe you're making a link to a user and then you interpolate the user ID or something like that into that link, and you just hard code it in your template or in your Python code somewhere. But that is sort of I'm lazy, so I don't want to actually have to worry about what that link is when I'm actually creating the link. I just want to create a link to a user object, no matter where it is, and how that link happens to be constructed. And then most routing web frameworks then offer a way to give your routes specific names, and then you can refer to the route name, and then you can interpolate, but you still need to know what variables go into that route. So you can refer to it by a name in your template, and you say, okay, give me a link to the user route, but I know I also need to provide this user ID here. And then how do you need to extract that user ID from somewhere. What Morepath does instead is, okay, I have a user object, just give me a link to it. And it knows itself how to get the user ID from the user. And that's sort of its primary goal, is not so much to prevent broken links sort of in the long lifetime of a website, but to make it easy to make these links in your web application and to provide a certain lack of to make the more coupling between things more loose and to make it easier to write generic code as well, because links often make it harder to write code reusable views. There are ways, I do think Morepath makes it easier to preserve links. It's still an explicit action you will need to do in your web application, but you could at least, if you know you're breaking a link, if you know that a URL is not there anymore where it used to be there before, what you can do is just create a dummy model that does nothing else than just redirect whenever it's accessed, or its view will do nothing else, and then redirect to the real place. And it would be easy to create a generic view for that, where the dummy model provides a way to get to the real model, and then the generic view that you write for this sort of redirect model just gets the real model first and then asks for a link to that, so that you sort of don't have to write these redirect views all the time. You just implement the redirect models and put them on the routes, and then they will start redirecting. So that's very easy to implement, but there's nothing in the framework itself that does that right now. Perhaps we should add a little extension to help you do that, because that's kind of a neat idea. Another thing that I've thought about, and I haven't actually used the feature, but the feature is in there. Morepath has a way to configure a link prefix where sort of all the links that you generate in an application will have a particular prefix, and you can also control the server name in that system. And that's useful for situations when you have a host, or you mount the application under a sub URL, or with virtual hosting it can also be useful. But it can also be useful when you have if you had a complicated web application that consisted of multiple sub applications. You can also mount applications in other applications in Morepath. You can sort of say, okay, this URL, everything under it is controlled by this other application that's mounted here. So you can do composition, not just inheritance. And if you live in a world where microservices are important, then each application could potentially end up living on its own host eventually, or at least on a different URL. And Morepath provides a way to evolve towards that. So you can start with a single application, and then you evolve it towards a bunch of applications that get mounted into each other. And then you say, okay, well, actually we want to run this sub application as a completely separate application, and run it in its own process. And then it's relatively easy to take that application and to run it separately. And then in your original application, you could create a dummy application with a bunch of sort of dummy objects that, when in your original application you link to them, automatically sort of link to the application on the other host, also in the other process. So it's a way to evolve your way towards microservices, if that's something that you consider useful. But that's just sort of more or less an idle thought I've had of how to exploit that link prefix feature in Morepath.
I can see where that would also be useful for the case where you're versioning an API, because a lot of times a RESTful interface will have a URL prefix of, /API/v1. And then when you need to release a version 2, you can say this particular portion of the application has a URL prefix of v2. So whenever somebody needs to use the newer version, it will automatically route over here, but we still have the previous version available at the old v1 URL.
Yeah, that's also a matter of mounting. So the way you would do that is you would just mount version 1 and you mount version 2 separately into a root, and then you just develop them as separate applications. And then you could do the redirect to another server if you wanted to.
And another one of the things that I found interesting while I was looking through the documentation is that it seems that Morepath has a different concept of what a model is than most of the other frameworks that I've dealt with, in that they aren't necessarily associated with a backend database. They can just be a plain Python object. So I'm wondering if you can explain how you arrived at that conception of models and some of the patterns that it allows for that might be different from the traditional database-oriented model.
Well, first of all, of course, any routing framework could use any Python code as its models already, right? If you are going to look up something, you don't have to look it up in a relational database. You could just construct whatever instance you need in whatever way you want on the fly in your view, and then just represent it. Then, of course, you often don't do that in a sort of a routing to view framework like a Flask or a Django, because you would just simply start generating the view from whatever data that you want to represent right away. So you wouldn't create that abstraction of a model first, and Morepath does encourage you to do that because you have to give it the URL. But I think that's a good thing. I think these things do need abstracting out. So what you typically end up with is that many routes in a Morepath application do route to a model that's backed by a relational database. But for things that are collections of models, you have these model classes that are not directly backed by a relational database, but instead provide an API that lets you interact with that relational database. So it lets you do querying, the collection, perhaps parts of the collection if you want to support batching. It lets you insert new items in the database, and then it has an API to delete items perhaps. And then you provide views for that collection. And I think that collection abstraction is very useful to have in any application. It's just that most web frameworks don't encourage you to create one, because then you can give that collection permissions specifically. You can also easily solve sort of make batching, where you have you want to display 10 items and have a next and a previous link. You can solve that very easily by having a collection that represents a batch. And then if you want to link to the next batch, you simply construct a collection that represents the next batch and you link to it, and the linking will work. So something that sometimes becomes a bit crafty or when you do batching sort of becomes very elegant, I think. So it encourages you to create these model classes, and I think that leads to better code organization in the end. It leads to more maintainable code, and I think that's a good thing.
So what are some of the most interesting or unexpected uses of Morepath that you've seen?
Well, I think the most unexpected thing is that I designed Morepath explicitly as a framework that was good at doing REST, but it turns out that making a framework that's good at doing REST, which is basically being good at doing HTTP, also makes for a framework that works very well for just traditional dynamic web applications that generate HTML with server templates. So one of the projects that is very, very big that's designed that way is a system called OneGov that's used by Swiss municipalities to run their government websites. And that's a mostly server-driven web application, and it turns out Morepath works just fine for that as well. So that was a bit of a surprise, but in retrospect, being good at HTTP makes you being good at traditional web applications as well. That's, the other thing that sort of keeps surprising me is sort of how one thing leads to another in creativity. So once you make certain design decisions, you get these follow-on creative ideas, and it doesn't stop as quickly as I thought in the beginning. So the whole field of web frameworks in Python is sort of, people tend to say they're all the same, and of course there are a lot of similarities between Python web frameworks, but it turns out there's still a lot of convenience features you can build into a web framework, and I enjoyed the aspect of discovering that. So the way Morepath deals with variables in URLs or URL parameters, Morepath sort of automatically converts the input, and it's surprising. Sort of like when you get an integer, it actually converts it to an integer for you and doesn't leave it up to the user code to do this. And then it can also generate an HTTP error if the conversion failed automatically. And it's surprising how many web frameworks don't handle things like that. And by handling things like that in the framework, it's there's less things that the developer needs to think about when they write web applications. Another aspect of that is HTTP errors. Because Morepath routes to a model instance. If you cannot find the model instance, you just return none from your route, and then Morepath just generates a 404. And when you look at something like Django, you have to actually use a specific API to do a database query that raises a 404 error if it doesn't find the item that you're looking for, and that just looks a lot more ugly that you solve this with a database lookup subsystem than it does in Morepath. So it can very elegantly deal with those errors, so you don't have to deal with 404 errors in your own code anymore. It sort of falls out the way you organize your code, and those things are very easy to forget, right? Because it works, and then now you need to start worrying about the errors, but those things are the things that you're not very inclined to do when you're developing code. So it's nice that it just works out of the box. And I discovered sort of a lot of little details with what a web framework can do for you that over time, that fell out of easier or earlier design decisions, so that the whole permission system is also quite powerful, because you can define permission where you can predict views with permissions, and then you can define permission rules where you say, okay, if I'm having a view and the view is for a document, but you can define permission rules that know about models, and I think that's very powerful, because you can then describe permissions rules for documents. I want to use this permission rule. For another kind of model class, I want to use another permission rule, and it allows you to very flexibly write very powerful rules for when someone has a permission or not. And again, that falls out of this separation of model and view that Morepath has, and that Morepath has knowledge about this, and then it can do stuff with it that most web frameworks don't have, because they don't have knowledge about models. So that was kind of an interesting journey of creativity, basically.
Yeah, the authorization capabilities of a lot of frameworks are frequently somewhat lacking or difficult to apply, and a lot of times sometimes the only way to apply the authorization capabilities is actually through an extension. So having that built into sort of the core of Morepath through the way that you interface with the models is definitely something that's fairly interesting, and seems like it would make that problem a little easier to solve.
Yeah, and it's not a lot of code in Morepath to allow you to do that. It's surprising also, I think. But one thing that surprised me is how much power that I was used to from SOAP could be written down in just a few thousand lines of code in the end. That's, I guess, another surprising outcome of this whole journey, that really you don't need giant piles of code in order to enable some very powerful features by using some very powerful concepts underneath, like configuration and predicate dispatch.
So what do you have planned for the future of Morepath?
Well, one thing that we've been thinking about a long time is a 1.0 release, because Morepath has been stable for some years now. I mean, we made some large internal changes, but it's not like it wasn't already solid 2 years ago. But we need to do that 1.0 release. We hope to also create a non-documentation website, a little bit of a marketing website. Along with that, so we'll see whether we manage to do that in the next year. One other thing we've been looking into recently is integration with more relational databases. We have integration through the transaction module and the more transaction extension with SQL Alchemy, and that also gets you integration with the C2B. So the transaction module is a general module that abstracts sort of the notion of a database transaction, and we integrate with that. But we're also looking into Pony ORM, because that looks like a nice ORM. See whether we can provide some integration for that. And recently I've been working on a tool. Well, I completed a tool that's called more.path info. I think it's called more.path tool, actually. And that provides a command line tool that gives you sort of a complete overview of what routes exist in your system and what views exist in your system, and sort of analyzes that, because one of the aspects of separating views from models is that sometimes it's a bit harder to reason about what's there, but this gives you basically just a CSV file that contains the information. And again, that's possible because we have an abstract notion we have a concept of configuration, so we can access the configuration database specifically and just query that instead of a whole bunch of ad hoc APIs. And I've been working on a tool that sort of you can use on the command line, and then just tells you more about why you got the result that you see on your screen, like what model was used to render this response and what view is used. That just gives you a little bit of debugging capability. And yeah, then otherwise we'll just have to see. We've been working a little bit more on the internals of the reg library. It's become a little bit faster still. That will be in a future release. Otherwise, I don't have any big plans. It also depends on what other people bring to the table. But I'm sure new ideas will arise eventually, because they always do.
Are there any other topics that you think we should cover before we start to close out the show?
No, I think that's a reasonable overview. I mean, I like talking about sort of I blogged about it, the history of my experience with Zope, so I can say a lot about that. I enjoyed your podcast about the interview with Eric Steele about Plone very much, because even though I never actually worked on Plone, I worked very close to Plone for years. So I have a bunch of blogs that are called My Exit from Zope, that sort of describe the history of Zope and my experiences with it. That might be interesting to people who are curious, like how frameworks not just arise, but also how they evolve and then perhaps die in the end, because soap is sort of undergoing this protracted death for some years now, even though Plone is still very much alive.
I was going to say, that definitely sounds like an interesting topic, so I'll be sure to add some links to that in the show notes for anybody who wants to check it out.
Yeah, and then another sort of general topic that interests me is sort of what it means to be creative as a software developer, because it's something that I can't help doing, creating new things, because I like just doing it. But I've thought quite a bit about what works well when you're creating a library or a framework, how the process of this creativity works. Then, for instance, with the routing system, I wanted a routing system with the benefits of a traversal system, and then you get this sort of dialectic where you want to do both at the same time, and that often results in creative new solution, trying to unify two different sort of things with each other. Another experience I had that somewhat like that is years ago I created the LXML library that's quite popular in Python land for dealing with XML and XML with XPath and XLT, etc. And when I created it, I sort of had these two poles. One was this libxml2 library that's very C and very low level and quite tricky to use, and you have to deal with manual memory management, etc. And on the other end, I had Elementary, which Frederick Lund had created already, which had a nice Pythonic API for dealing with XML. And sort of my contribution after spending a few years messing around creating all kinds of half-baked XML libraries for Python that never got any traction was sort of the minimal contribution I could make, is to say, okay, I take the Elementary API and I add it on top of libxml2, and that's what I do. I don't invent new APIs where I don't have to. I don't implement XML processing libraries where I don't have to. I just unify them, and that was my most successful open source project, I think, especially because Stefan Benel took over the project after a year and has maintained it very capably since then and extended its capabilities quite a lot. But I sort of realized, like, hey, I've created something new here by doing the minimum act of creation possible by just connecting two things together that are already there. And I find that's an interesting way to think about creativity in software as well. So that's sort of a topic that interests me, and I like giving talks about it once every while for Python conferences.
All right. For anybody who wants to follow you or keep in touch, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Well, I have a blog at blog.starteffect.com, and I also have a Twitter account, and I tweet fairly often. It's called Faassen. That's my last name, which you can probably find in the show notes. And it's I also have a GitHub account that has that name as well. So those would be good ways to see what I'm up to. And yeah, feel free to drop me an email as well, of course.
Great. With that, I will move us into the picks. And my picks today are, first I'm going to choose the Internet Movie Database, the IMDb, because it's a good way to see what some of the upcoming movies are and look up information and trivia about the various movies. I've been using that as my sort of discovery mechanism since I don't really watch TV or see any of the commercials for upcoming movies. So every now and then I'll browse through and see what it has in the sort of top scroll to see if there are any movies that I find interesting. And I also use that to keep track of the movies that I want to watch. So it's a good way to do that.
I always use it when I'm watching something and I recognize the actor or the actress, and it's like, who is this? I have no idea. I've seen them in something else. And then you go for the IMDb for that particular episode or whatever it is, and then you look through the cast list, and then you can click on them and see what other things they appeared in, which sort of solves one of these not very important problems that you have when you're watching something. It's like, I recognize that guy. Who is it?
Yeah, I definitely use it for that all the time as well. And then my other pick today is just going to be gyroscopes, because they're a fun little toy to play with, and it's a good way to experiment with the weird physics that is angular momentum. So with that, I will pass it to you. Do you have any picks for us today, Martijn?
So I have a podcast pick that has nothing to do with Python whatsoever, but it's about it's by two game designers. It's quite well known. It's called Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff. They're both role-playing game designers, and in this podcast they talk about stuff, which doesn't just talk about, don't just talk about role-playing games, but anything else that interests them, which includes history and the occult and conspiracies and food and lots of other things, narrative, principles of narrative and things like that. And yeah, I find it's a very interesting geeky mixture to listen. And my other pick is Viili, which is a Finnish yogurt that I'm making for myself these days. So I got into the fermentation hobby some years ago, where I'm fermenting weird stuff, food and very strange drinks. And I've been enjoying Vili lately. Vili is this Finnish yogurt, which is very easy to ferment because it's mesophilic, meaning it will do its job at room temperature. So you just take some Vili and you put it in milk and you wait for a day or maybe 2 days, and then you have a batch of new Vili, and then you take some Vili from that and you put it in milk, and then you get more yogurt. And Vili has this very interesting consistency. It's sort of, I would say, part of what it's a very mild yogurt, because proteins, I believe, that are generated by the bacteria that create the yogurt also create this weird ropey long proteins that give it sort of a very slimy consistency. It behaves very strange when you scoop it on a spoon. It sort of, a lot of it comes with it in threads below it. And there's a story that somebody was making Vili in an open pot and put too much milk in the pot, and then the next day the pot was empty and all the Vili was sitting next to it because it had pulled itself out in the process of forming. But it actually, the mouthfeel is not as disgusting as I make it sound now. It's actually very nice to eat. It's a very nice mild yogurt, and it's very easy to make, and it's kind of fascinating how you can just put a bit of yogurt into some other yogurt, or into some milk, and then do nothing, and then you have more yogurt the next day. That's magical. I like that.
It's very interesting. I'll have to look into that a bit.
Yeah, you spell that V and then IILI, so it has a Finnish double I in there.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today and talk about Morepath. It's definitely an interesting framework with a lot of interesting concepts in it, so I'm sure I'll be looking more into it and maybe using it in a future project.
Thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed this too, and thank you for the interview as well.